Breaking down Arizona basketball and the Big Four and where everything figures to go in the Big 12 this coming season, plus maybe a little bench talk for Arizona basketball.
You are Locked On Wildcats, your daily podcast on the Arizona Wildcats. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for keeping it Locked On Wildcats. I am your host, Mike Luke. All right, we got a lot to get to this show. First and foremost, we're going to talk about the Big 12, but that was called a tease. We're not going to talk about that first and foremost. We're going to talk about a little bit of Arizona bench play because we've obviously got some big stuff coming down the pipe here in the next or pike. I don't know. I never know which one that is. In the next probably 96 hours or so. So wanted to talk a little bit just kind of about the bench for Arizona. And my question is this the best bench under the Tommy Lloyd era? Let's imagine that you're going to add one more player, which I think it's fair to say you probably will add one more player. And I think that the question then at that point becomes, where is the where does that bench reside in the Tommy Lloyd era? You think of that first year, it was obviously one of the, it was just kind of a lightning in a bottle type thing where you just had awesome starters, not necessarily a great bench. It was decent enough though. And then, you look at it in retrospect, and like last year, you had KJ Lewis. Not only did you have KJ Lewis, you had Jaden Bradley. Those were obviously very, very nice, very, very nice pieces for the University of Arizona. But now let's look at the bench that you got now. You've got Tobe Awaka, which is going to be kind of that jack of all trades, I think, big man for the U of A. It's going to come in with a lot of physicality, a lot of power, and that's something that I think is going to be very, very needed, especially in the Big 12. Then you look at somebody like an Anthony Del Orso, think that he's going to be very, very good as well. Big fan of what he can possibly bring to the table. And then you need to talk a little bit Carter Bryant. 5-star kid. We all know what Carter can do. I think he's going to be, like I said, in that 16 to 20 minute per game range. But you're going to need all of these dudes to be able to get to where you want to get. I like it. And then obviously you got two wild cards in the mix. And again, these are two very, very good wild cards, but they're two wild cards in the mix. And what's exciting about Henry Vasar and Conrad Martinez is that maybe you've got a little bit of a how do I put this? A little bit of a differential going on here in that Henry Vasar has got upside. I mean, he does. Now, he hasn't necessarily shown that he's a big-time player, but Henry Vasar certainly has upside, and that's something that I think that, could be lost a little bit, even lost on people like myself, is, what the upside is that he can bring to the table, because he can run the court, he can block shots, he can shoot, he can shoot threes to a certain extent. He's there, like I said, there's a lot to like about Henry Vasar, but I think the other thing that you also have to look at is where exactly, where do those minutes come from? And that's a good thing. And you hope that Henry Vasar can force his way onto the court. Then Conrad Martinez, certainly doesn't necessarily look the part, but he's been very, very good whenever Arizona has called on him. Granted, they were all kind of in, for lack of a better term, scrub minutes, but those are two guys that I think have the potential to be pretty, pretty good for the University of Arizona. We will see how that all plays out. But I like the bench a lot. I think they're going to add to the bench. Wink, wink. But overall, though, I think you're looking at a very solid 8-man rotation and possibly 9. Who knows? Maybe more. I think a lot of this will just depend on what Tommy Lloyd is able to do, what Tommy Lloyd is able to bring in. But you're going to need these going into the Big 12, and I think a big part of this is where exactly does Arizona reside, and that to me is something that I think is very, very, very interesting. Where does Arizona reside? And honestly, I think that you're probably looking at something that I think you probably in a battle for second place, but who knows? I think you can beat Kansas, but let's just look at that though first. Kansas is the clear top dog. I mean, they're absolutely loaded. Bill Self made an absolute killing in the transfer portal, and he retained almost everybody that he needed to retain. You've got Hunter Dickinson at that center spot. He's obviously fantastic. Then you got KJ Adams at that power forward spot. He's an all-conference defensive player. Then you've also got DeJuan Harris, kind of the steady Eddie at the point. And then AJ Storr, Zeke Mayo, guys like that. And then coming off the bench, you've also got five-star guys because that's what they do. It's a loaded team. Like I said, it's an incredibly loaded team. And honestly, I think that, this is a team that should probably be the preseason number one team in the country. And I think that's probably going to be the way that it is. Now, looking at some of the other teams in there, and this is where it becomes very fascinating, is where exactly does Arizona reside? Because after that, you got Houston, and then I think Houston, you return, 7 of 8 starters. Now, granted, with you lose Jamal Shed, that's obviously a big loss. Jamal Shed was a fantastic, fantastic basketball player for Houston from a defensive mentality, from a underrated offensively. And you saw against Duke what he meant. When Jamal Shed went out of the game, they were not the same team. They were not even close to the same team. And that's something that I think you've obviously got to keep in mind. Then when it comes to let's see here, another team that's in there, Baylor. Baylor's become kind of a national brand under Scott Drew, and they are loaded, but they also bring in a loaded roster as well, in that you're returning some players, obviously, but you're bringing in VJ Hedgecomb. You're bringing in the kid from Miami that was a double-double machine. Those are 3 of the top, in my opinion. Those are 3 of the probably on paper top 6-7 teams in college basketball. Now, I actually have some more questions about Houston than I think some other people do, mainly because you lose Jamal Shed, and I don't think replacing him with Milos Uzon is the same thing. I think that is something that, is not necessarily ideal, but it's still obviously a very, very good team. So those 3 teams are going to be monsters. And again, Kansas, I think, is clearly the best team, because I don't really think that Kansas on paper has a ton of question marks, because again, once you got AJ Storr, that was pretty much, I think, was game on at that point from a wing position, because you're replacing him with Kevin McCullough, or replacing Kevin McCullough with him. And then we obviously went over Baylor. We went over Houston as well. And then you've obviously got Iowa State. Iowa State returns everybody. Now, Iowa State, I think, probably has the most underrated home court advantage in the country. And that's something that, like I said, that's going to be, stop me if you've heard this before, that's going to be something that Arizona's going to have to deal with in every venue that they go into, is a home court environment where it's just a little bit different. You don't necessarily see, this stuff, obviously, in the Big 12. The best comparison I could bring up is, honestly, probably going into McHale every single game. That's kind of where it's at. And we'll talk about some bottom dwellers here in a second, but also want to talk first about how Arizona matches up with all those teams. But First, eBay Motors, my friends. eBay Motors. Check it out. Here's the deal with eBay Motors. Cut out the middleman. Millions of parts for your MVP. Win every time with parts that fit your ride. Check it out. eBay Motors. Again, I think a lot of people are tired of being screwed over by a person that goes and that they're probably charging you too much, but you don't really feel like you got another option. eBay Motors is here for you, my friends. eBay Motors is where millions of parts for your MVP. Win every time with parts that fit your ride. Another one of these ones where you will thank me later. Again, check it out. eBay Motors, all kinds of good people. Millions of parts for your MVP. Win every time with parts that fit your ride. Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats and making this your first listen of the day. I am your host, Mike Luke. All right, now let's talk a little bit now about where Arizona matches up in the grand scheme of things. So I think Arizona can match up with any of those teams because I think Arizona is adaptable in pretty much all phases. In that, I think that they can play big, they can play slow it down if they want. Obviously, they don't want to play slow it down, but that certainly is an option for them. And if you want to go fast, which is what Arizona prefers, you're going to go fast as well. Again, like I said, very, very, very enthused by all of these possibilities for Arizona, and I think they're going to match up well with all these teams. Honestly, like with Kansas, Kansas got a lot of size. Arizona can counter that. But, if you go with a team that maybe goes a little bit smaller as well at times, maybe like a Baylor, if they go a little bit smaller, then it becomes a little bit more interesting as well. So again, I think with Arizona, you kind of know what you're getting, but you also know that you have a roster that Tommy Lloyd has put together that I think is very, very good for what Arizona wants to do in the Big 12. And again, there's going to be some growing pains for sure. And I think that's something that you got to keep in mind is that this is not going to be like it when you play in the, Pac-12 where, got some bye weeks for lack of a better term. This is going to be a different animal, I think, for the U of A and for U of A fans, but that is a good thing, not a bad thing. We want better teams. We want more challenges, and we are going to embrace those. Now, let's talk about some teams that I think are going to suck. Colorado, I think they stink. Besides having a very odd fan base that it gets very, very upset. And if anybody questions Deion Sanders, Colorado basketball, no thanks. And I think in the Big 12, they're going to get absolutely annihilated. You lost a number of players off their team this past year. And again, Tad Boyle is kind of the John Tesh of college basketball. Okay, maybe it won't turn the channel, but you're certainly looking for something else. Then Utah, don't really see much, although I do like Craig Smith a great deal. I think he's a very good coach. And then ASU. ASU is going to be fascinating because you're bringing in a couple 5-star kids. You got a pretty good roster, but Bobby Hurley, even though I like Bobby Hurley as a person, Bobby Hurley has not shown that he can coach, which is just such an odd thing because you're dealing with, maybe the most cerebral point guard in NCAA basketball history. But Hurley has not shown that he can coach, period, point blank. And that's where that's kind of where it's at with that. Now, we're going to talk about some of the middle ground teams here in just a second. Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats and making this your first listen of the day. I am your host, Mike Luke. All right, now, thanks. Now, let's talk about a little bit about where we are at with the middle pack. Now, there's a lot of teams in here that are interesting. Now, take Central Florida for a second. Central Florida had wins last year over Kansas and I believe Baylor, and they were one of the worst teams in the country. I think they'll probably have a little bit more talent this year. But you look at schools like a Texas Tech, like a Cincinnati, like a BYU. Those all should be kind of middle of the ground or middle of the road teams. And in the Pac-12, they would have probably competed for a second or third place finish. That's just, like I said, that's just the difference, though, that we're going to be dealing with, that we're going to be seeing in the Big 12. But Arizona is clearly in that upper echelon, that top 5. Then you got the bottom dwellers. Then you got the ones in the middle. I think what's going to help Arizona as well is that you've also got a team that is able to play a variety of different ways. And like we talked about, that's why we talked about the bench at the beginning. I think the bench is going to be very, very important in the Big 12 because you're going to get into foul trouble and you're going to need some of these dudes to be able to come in and be impact players. So, all right. Now, on Monday, we're going to have a massive show because we're going to have a lot of recruiting information to break down between Koa Pete, Tunde Yesufu, and a couple other ones as well, but lots of really good stuff going on. And we'll be talking about some Arizona football as well. But as always, you all have a very, very good weekend, and it very much appreciate you making Locked On Wildcats your first listen of the day. Again, going to have a monster show on Monday. We are going to talk a lot of Arizona basketball recruiting because there is a lot to talk about when it comes to Arizona basketball recruiting with some very big names. But on that note, I'm Mike Luke. Thanks for keeping it Locked On Wildcats. Bear down, back the A, and thanks for making Locked On Wildcats your first listen of the day. Oh, and by the way, real quick, we're going to go over some Big 12 football stuff on Monday as well.